Josh McDowell, for example, set out to disprove Christianity. He was a student he was a law student, and a girl in one of his classes says, Christians have two brains. One's out to lunch and the other's out looking for it. And he said, or Josh said that to the woman, and she said, well, if you're so smart, why don't you disprove it? And he said, I will. So for 2 years, Josh McDowell set on a journey to disprove Christianity, and he went after two things: the Bible, because that's our truth source. If you can discredit the Bible, then we have no truth source that's reliable. And Jesus, because if Jesus isn't who he claimed to be, then the whole thing's a myth, a legend. It's not true. So in that journey, Josh McDowell, to try to disprove Christianity, he ran headlong into the evidence, much of which we're going to present to you today, and he became a believer in Jesus, and he wrote over 30 best-selling books. And so when I began to read his stuff, what it did for me is it deepened my eyes. Let me explain that. When I moved from Georgia to Minneapolis, I graduated at UGA in 1983. I moved to Minneapolis, became a college pastor. It was the first time I'd ever encountered frozen lakes. Now in Georgia, you have ice on a lake that you would never step out on or you're going to fall in. But in Wisconsin and in Minnesota at the time, the ice is like 3 feet thick. And they drive trucks across lakes, 18-wheelers across some lakes. I remember the first time I went on a frozen lake in Minneapolis, I'm tiptoeing on the edge thinking, is it safe to step on? I look over and there's a truck driving across. All of a sudden I'm like, man, this is safe. I can step out. Because I didn't realize there was a couple feet of ice. Well, what today is going to do for you if you're a believer, it's going to thicken your ice. It's going to give you substance to your faith. Hebrews 11 says faith is the substance of things hoped for. There's substance to our faith. Believing in Jesus, becoming a Christian, is not a blind leap in the dark where you have to throw your brain out the window. Just the opposite. The answers are there. The evidence is there. The archaeological, the historical, the intellectual. I'm going to call it proof because that's what it says in the book of Acts. It says that Paul proved to them that Jesus was the Christ. And he did it in a number of ways, which we'll talk about today. But so that's what I pray it does. Now again, we welcome those of you that may be skeptics, those of you that may not be believers, those of you that may have serious questions. One of the things I love about our church here is we welcome everybody and anybody. And we're all in the process and in the journey. And so we welcome you being here and we welcome your questions. So, that's a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to now hand it to Dr. Rich Suplita. He's married to Mary Catherine. They together have 4 children. He has a PhD in psychology. He was a professor at the University of Georgia in the psychology department. At the time, he was the faculty advisor to the Atheist Club. Yes, he was not only an atheist, he was the faculty advisor of the Atheist Club at UGA. So he was an evangelistic atheist. He wanted to deconvert Christians and put more people in the atheist camp. And long story short, he became a believer in Jesus because of the things that you're going to hear him present today. And so I'm excited to do this with him. But he's going to carry most of the weight because his stuff is so good, I can't improve on it. So I told him, I'm just teeing you up. You kick the 60-yard field goal today. And so we'll be doing 3 sections. Is there a God? Is the Bible God's Word? And is Jesus God's Son? Come on up, Rich.
I raised that a bit. All right, thank you. Yeah, good morning. Thank you all for coming out. And, previously we had done this on a like 8-week session type thing. All right, yeah, people in here. So we decided, you know what, we're just going to do kind of an Apologetics 101 and do it one shot, Saturday morning, provide coffee and breakfast, and just talk about the essentials. So mostly what we're going to do today is give you some of the basic arguments, right, for why it makes sense to believe in God, how the Bible is the Word of God. You can trust the Bible. It's valid, it's reliable. And then thirdly, that Jesus Christ is real. He really is the Son of God. And we're going to specifically focus on the case for the resurrection of Jesus. Lee Strobel called the resurrection the linchpin of Christianity. If you could disprove the resurrection somehow, Christianity fails. No resurrection, no Christianity. And so we're going to talk about that. So the idea is that this is to whet your appetite. In your packet, you'll notice at the end of each section several resources. That is by no means an exhaustive list. Just some of the sources that I used putting this together. And so I tried to intersperse like some videos, some interesting videos. Some of them are only a few minutes long. Some of them are longer, like debates. Some book references, and also some essays and articles that you can check into. We have a whole lot more than that. If you want to, this apologetics thing goes as deep as you want to take it. Okay, trust me. And so if you run out of material here, check in with me, Mary Catherine. We can send you some more resources. And so if you turn in your packet, I need to kind of launch into this. I'll start my timer here. You know YouTube has little timers you can download any length you want. That's very helpful in this kind of situation. So we're going to start there. It's on page 3, right? Page 3. You didn't give 1 Peter 3:15, so I will.
No, I did.
You did?
But
Okay.
very
Right,
brief.
right. Okay, yeah. Okay, so like I said, there's going to be a lot of material here. We're going to go through it quickly. I'm not going to read everything here verbatim, obviously. We're going to focus on the blanks. I'll do some comments. And we want to make sure that at the end of each session, we have like 10, maybe even 15 minutes for questions. During that time, by the way, if you need to refill your coffee, you need to go to the restroom, avail yourself of that time to do that while we're answering the questions. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, all right, so part 1 here. God exists. In other words, atheism is false. That's the inverse way of stating that. God exists. Therefore, atheism, the denial of God, right, is false. I have some select scriptures there. I want to focus specifically on Romans 1, 19 and 20. This is such a powerful statement by the Apostle Paul. As he begins the letter to the Romans, he says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them." To who? To humankind. Okay? Because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived. Clearly perceived. Ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. Okay? So in other words, the person who would deny God, Paul is saying, there's such robust evidence. The evidence is so manifest. All right? It's so incontrovertible. It's so obvious that people don't have an excuse for saying, God hasn't provided me with enough evidence. All right? The most common form of atheism encountered today, the next blank there, is naturalism. Naturalism. Sometimes this is called scientific naturalism. I don't like that. I object to that because I see that as an attempt to smuggle science, right, into a philosophical position, a metaphysical position, and that's not fair, okay? But we're just going to call it naturalism. Another term that is used interchangeably, there's a couple of terms. I'm going to stick with naturalism. You may hear physicalism, you may hear materialism. They all refer to the same philosophical position, more precisely metaphysical position. And basically, naturalism, your next blank, holds that the only reality is physical reality. That's the only reality. You got stuff, right? You got different types of stuff in the universe, and you have energy. So matter and energy, that's it. Okay? So the only reality is physical reality. There are 3 ways naturalism shows up in education and culture. And again, if we were doing a whole class, we would go into these more deeply. We don't have time today. I'll just give them to you. You can ask questions about them later if you like. Number 1 is Big Bang Cosmology. Right, Big Bang Cosmology. We all know that it all started with a Big Bang, right? Some of you are chuckling, you know the show. All right, so Big Bang Cosmology. That 13.7 billion years ago, there was this singularity, and then, it started inflating at a massive rate. And that's where we got squirrels and elephants and people in the Andromeda Galaxy. Okay, so Big Bang Cosmology. The second is Evolutionism. Yes, I said that intentionally. Evolutionism. Okay? So the word evolution with an ISM at the end. Why? Because it's a doctrine. I'm not talking about the details of natural selection and birds' beaks changing their length and all of that. But this idea that there's constant change, and essentially what we mean by evolutionism is the scenario where you go from chemicals to these primitive cells, right, all the way up through humankind. So molecules to man evolution. which is not scientific, by the way. I don't want to get on a rabbit trail, but just to be clear, that's not science. And notice whenever they want to convince you of evolution in that sense, what do? They start talking about birds' beaks and turtle sizes and antibiotic resistance, bacteria changing from bacteria into other types of bacteria, right? But evolutionism is the idea that you're going to see naturalism show up that way in our culture. The last one is Marxism or neo-Marxism. So much you could say about this, but the idea that social and economic change occur through conflict, not through gradual change. That's kind of a paradox. But they occur through conflict or struggle. Okay, so here's where we really want to get to. Atheism and naturalism is false because God exists of logical necessity. Probably one of my favorite volumes. It's a short volume, but it's not an easy read. Costs you like $7 to get a paperback copy. I highly recommend it. It's Francis Schaeffer. He is there and he is not silent. I think it's in your references there. He is there and he is not silent. And he goes through 3 ways in which God exists necessarily, of logical necessity, okay? Necessity, sorry. So God exists, number 1, as the logically necessary first cause. I think I skipped one, didn't I? Okay, sorry. In other words, God cannot not exist. There you go. God cannot not exist. That's what it means that God exists of logical necessity. If God exists necessarily, and we're going to submit that he does, then the opposite of that is impossible. The impossibility of the opposite. Okay? That's the strategy of argument that we're going with here. God cannot not exist. So 3 ways in which it is logically necessary for God to exist. Number 1, God exists as the logically necessary first cause. The logically necessary first cause. This argument has been around for a long time. At least back to Augustine, or Augustine, depending on how do you say it? Augustine. That's the right way to say it.
No, not necessarily.
All the way back to Augustine. God as the first cause. There have been different variations of this argument. Probably the one that gets the most press today is called the Cosmological argument. Kalam. Actually, this was a case that was, this was an iteration of the cosmological argument, the first cause argument, that was developed by an Islamic scholar. Okay, Kalam is kind of an Arabic type word, so that's the root of the term Kalam. So very briefly, it's stated like this. Okay, number 1. So what you have basically 2 propositions, 2 premises. Right? 2 statements that can either be true or false, and then a conclusion. So number 1, anything that begins to exist must have a cause that is beyond itself. Anything that begins to exist, anything that starts to exist, that has a starting point, must have a cause beyond itself. Number 2, the universe or the cosmos, right? The universe or the cosmos, those are interchangeable terms. I think cosmos is the Greek word for universe. The universe began to exist. It's not existed forever. Now, okay, we could have a long discussion on, is the universe 6,000 years old? Is it 13.7 billion years old? For what we're doing here, it does not matter. It is not infinite in age. Okay, it's not been around forever. The universe began to exist. At some point, some finite point in the past, the universe began to exist. Therefore, number 3, therefore the universe must have a cause that is beyond itself. Now that's very simple, right? Anything that begins with just has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause outside of itself. But if you grant that the truth of the first 2 premises, if it's true that anything that begins to exist must have a cause outside of itself, and if it's true that the universe began to exist, then it necessarily follows. Like this is a knockdown case logically. of logical necessity, we can deduce that the universe has a cause that is beyond itself. Okay, Schaeffer really goes into this. We don't have time today, but I'll give you the two logical possibilities. He really kind of makes three categories. I'm simplifying. Okay, there are two logical possibilities for that cause. Either one, it is purely physical, some other type of stuff that was around before the Big Bang, ad infinitum, okay, as you rewind the tape. Or, the only other possibility, if it's not physical, is that it's, I'm going to go ahead and say it, personal. It's either a physical cause or it's a personal cause, some type of spirit or soul or mind. The Greeks call this the nous, right? N-O-U-S. But something that is an entity that can choose to create, right? That does not itself, is not made up of matter. It's not made up of stuff. It's some type of pure mind or spirit or soul. Well, what does that sound like? God, right? So the other option is that the cause is personal. It's someone rather than something, okay? So we can rule out, number one, due to the impossibility, this gets technical, I'm not going to go into this long, the impossibility of traversing an infinite series. What does that mean? If it's true that matter has been around forever, okay, then in order to get to today, you would have to cross an infinite sequence, right? Literally an infinite sequence of cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect. Well, logically, this is impossible. A good reference there, if you want to look into it, William Lane Craig, his Reasonable Faith site, he has entire articles, entire presentations just on this one truth. But it's impossible to cross or traverse an infinite series of cause-effect events. Therefore, the universe was caused by an enormously powerful spiritual entity, someone, right? Someone, and not something. All right, if you have questions, save them for the end. We're going to jump right into the next section. Okay. You can see the resources on there. All right, number two, God exists as the logically necessary designer. This is the design argument. Okay. The logically necessary designer. The fancy term for this, we had cosmological for the last one. The fancy term for this is teleological argument. Or just the design argument, that works. Rather than being a deductive case, this is an inductive case. So we're going to go from observation, 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 and then extract a general principle. That's the way inductive reasoning goes. Okay? My favorite way to do this, Mary loves this, is called the 5-second quiz. Okay? That's your next thing. My favorite way is the 5-second quiz. How do you do that? Okay, quick, within the next 5 seconds, someone give me proof that shoe designers exist. Can you do that? There you go, right there. There it is. The existence of shoes, right, is, I'm not very flexible, is proof that a shoe designer exists, right? We know there's a designer because of the product, because of the characteristics, the attribute of the thing that's been produced. We'll do another one. How about eyeglasses designer? 5 seconds. Can somebody, there we go, right? So you just hold up your eyeglasses. All right. How about cell phone designers? 5 seconds. There you go. You guys get the picture. How about authors? There's a great one right there. We'll get into that later. So books are evidence that authors exist. Now, did you need to see the person actually writing the book, making the eyeglasses, putting together the design for the shoes? No, all you need to do is see the product. You can walk by a building that Frank Lloyd Wright designed, and you could say, you might not know the name, right? But you say, wow, there was an enormously gifted and talented and brilliant designer who made the plan for this structure. That's a proper inference, okay? Okay, so consider your body now. Within the next 5 seconds, someone give me proof for a designer of the human body, right? Well, there you are. Right, there you are in the mirror. So consider your body. Within virtually each of the 30 to 40 trillion cells of your body, that's a staggering number, the entire library of DNA in virtually all of those cells. Okay, there are things like red blood cells that don't have DNA. We'll get into that. But most of your cells, in each one of those cells, is the entire library of information to reconstruct your entire body. That should just kind of blow your mind, right? Yeah. Required to build your whole body. This is roughly 700 megabytes of data. That might not sound very impressive. The next number will. Contained in every cell. 700 megabytes of data, and you have 30 to 40 trillion copies of that just in your body alone. It is estimated that 1 gram of DNA, 1 gram, that's not that much, is it? I mean, you're talking, you guys know what a kilogram is. That's 2.2 pounds. So 1/1000 of 2.2 pounds. Okay, that's 1 gram of DNA is capable of storing 215 petabytes. That's over 215 billion megabytes of data. So this medium for containing information that can be translated into a physical product, i.e. your body, is just amazing. In fact, this is where we're going with computing today. They're getting away from the standard model. This is not my field, but they're trying to get into models of information storage that are based, really, that work kind of like DNA does, because you can store so much more information in a much more compact space. All right, so an app metaphor, page 5 here. An app metaphor for how the data or information in your DNA builds your body. CAD/CAM, CAD/CAM. Computer Assisted Design, CAD. Computer Assisted Manufacturing is CAM. How does that work? Well, if you guys have seen a 3D printer, there's all kinds of things you can do with that today. How does that work? Somebody designs a program. You want to build a thing, a 3-dimensional object, part for a car. They're doing this with guns now. You can do it with all kinds of things, right? Somebody designs the program, and then the program is sent from the computer to the 3D printer, and as that information is fed to the printer, a 3-dimensional structure, right, is printed out. It's usually, very often, it's part of a functional unit, okay? This is very, very, very much the way that DNA works in your body. The information is there, it's translated, you've got mRNA, tRNA, ribosomes, all that stuff, right? But ultimately, what you get is proteins, and your body is built up of different types of proteins, mostly, okay? So here's a common objection. Skipping to the next paragraph, answering common objection. I used to say this, and I hear skeptics today say, well, aren't patterns, even very complex patterns, like the patterns you see in a snowflake under a microscope or in crystals, aren't those something that can ostensibly occur without an intelligent mind behind them? Well, maybe not. That's a different argument. But even if we grant that, even if we were to grant that, it's not the same thing. Okay, we're not talking about the same type of information. We're talking about information or language. The existence of language, information that's stated, instructions that are put together to build something is always the result of an intelligent mind, not just a recurring pattern in something like a crystal. Okay? I love the example that Cliff Knechtle gives here. You're going on a long walk along the beach, very romantic setting, right? Long walk. See, they ever say, I like short walks on the beach, you know? It's a long walk on the beach. Never hear that. And so there you are with your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, whoever you're with, your dog, maybe, I don't know. And scenario one, you're walking down the beach, and Mary says to me, hey, how did these wavy lines, these parallel wavy lines get on the shoreline? Recurrent pattern, you know. I'm like, oh, that's easy. Well, you know, the tide comes in, the tide goes out, and as the tide goes out, it kind of leaves these parallel wavy lines in the sand. Do you buy it? Is that a good explanation?
Yeah.
That's fair, right? It's a fair explanation. Physical processes alone can explain that. All right, we walk a little bit further, and we see, this is a beach in the south, we see Billy Bob loves Charlene. Right? Okay. Written, inscribed in the sand. And Mary says, Rich, how did that get there? And I said, that's easy. The tide comes in, and the tide goes out. You know, it picked up some little pieces of wood or something in a certain pattern, and it just happened to come out, Billy Bob loves Charlene. Do you buy it? No, of course not. Why not? What's the difference? Intellect. It's language. It's a statement that obviously has a mind behind it, right? You're saying it's something that is using language to communicate an idea. Okay? Those are completely different scenarios. What we're talking about with DNA, Francis Collins, the former head of NIH, who I don't like all of his stuff on creation because he's a theistic evolutionist, again, different topic, but he is a evangelical Christian. He wrote a book called The Language of God, and he states that DNA is not like a language. DNA is a language. That's a better way to look at it. It doesn't operate like a language. It's much more accurate to say that it is actually a language, so he calls it the language of God. Okay. All right, moving on down to number 3. Oh, well, okay, yeah, we better do that for time's sake. Number 3, God exists as the absolute standard of moral truth. Oh man, this is such a great one for today. The moral argument for God. This is my go-to. I use the other two. I probably use this on the streets and on campuses like 10 times more frequently. So God exists as the absolute standard of moral truth. Another quiz for you. With each statement indicate, just circle, whether you believe it is a fact or an opinion. Spring is the best season of year in Georgia. I'm going to say opinion if for no other reason than I have allergies. Okay. Mint chocolate chip ice cream is the best ice cream. Wendy's has better French fries than McDonald's. Opinion. Now notice I didn't put Chick-fil-A because that might actually be a fact.
Is.
Daytona Beach is the best place to take a vacation. All right. So hopefully you had opinion for those 4. Now notice the contrast. Hitler's Holocaust against the Jews was evil. Fact or opinion? I'm going to put fact, and if somebody says, hey, that's just an opinion, I'm going to say, no, you're wrong. It's a fact. That was evil. How about this one? Child sex offenders should be punished to the fullest extent of the law. The KKK is a wicked organization. The extreme example here, it would be wrong to torture babies just for fun. Fact. Hopefully you did fact. If you didn't put fact for that, we might have to have a talk.
Our security team might need to watch you.
Yeah. Okay, so again, we have something called the moral argument for God, stated propositionally. That means that's a formal argument. Very simple. Number 1, if God does not exist, then moral facts do not exist. No God, no moral facts. Number 2, moral facts do exist. Number 3, therefore God exists. Now notice, it's not saying that everything we moralize about is a moral fact. Okay? That's not the claim. The claim is that there are at least some things that are objectively wrong, objectively evil, or objectively good. Okay? Even if there's just one, the argument works. Even if there's just one thing that for all people in all places at all time is really, really wrong objectively, the argument works. You know, people moralize about should you watch this movie or not, or should you dress like that or not. With those types of things, there's not an objective standard. But for things like we listed here, KKK is evil, Holocaust was evil, there is, okay? So this is a deductive argument stated in a valid form. So again, if 1 and 2 are true, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must necessarily be true. And so just I want you to imagine here the alternatives. Rather than getting into a long, exposition of this, just imagine the opposite. Imagine that the alternative to the existence of moral facts, because that's usually where skeptics will challenge this. And we've had people on campus tell us this, right? No, you're right. Torturing babies for fun really isn't objectively morally wrong, not in the grand universal sense. It's just we kind of have a consensus as humans. It really is kind of like our strong opinion, and most people have that opinion, and so we might as well call it a fact. People will actually push back there and claim to you that rape is not really wrong, okay? That the KKK, the lynchings in the American South, weren't really pure evil. And I look at them and I'm like, are you serious? You're going to tell me that with a straight face, that wasn't abhorrently evil. And usually they back down some, or they'll whisper back to you because they don't want their friends to hear that they just said that, okay? So imagine the opposite. I wouldn't personally have Holocaust, but who am I to judge Adolf Hitler? We can't really say that serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy did something objectively wrong. After all, they were just being true to themselves. You be you, right? Well, for Ted Bundy, that was to become a serial killer. The historical actions of the KKK and other white supremacist groups are neither inherently good nor evil. It's just a matter of your personal perspective. Morality is a social construct. So the only reason you think that's evil is because you were brought up in a certain circumstance. Nobody really believes that. People might tell you that, but they don't really believe it. A lot of the people that tell me that they look at social constructivism as their subjective guide to moral truth will then turn around and start giving you a litany of things in the Old Testament that they think are objectively evil. Okay? So they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. They're not consistent with their own narrative. Okay?
Good point.
Yeah. Okay, so these statements strike us as absurd and even vile. Okay? Why? Because we all know that moral facts exist. We live in a moral universe. We don't live in an amoral universe. We live in a moral universe. No matter how hard we might try to deny it, there is no getting away from that truth. But if moral facts exist, then moral truth that transcends individuals, some sort of objective, transcendent standard of moral truth, something that transcends you and me, it transcends cultures. Again, a word on that. You've heard of cultural or social constructivism. Some of you in college have heard of that. Morality is a social construct, or gender is a social construct, or they give you all of these examples. Well, who's it constructed by? It's constructed by people, okay? So really, it just backs up the argument. It isn't like culture's out there existing on its own. Culture's made up of people, okay? So something that transcends individuals, cultures, and societies, that is true for all people in all places at all times. If that's true, then there must exist a transcendent and independent standard of moral truth. Okay? That standard is found in the very nature, or you could put essence, nature or essence of God. This gets us around something called Euthyphro's dilemma. Divine command theory. Did God just willy-nilly pick? He flipped a coin one day and came down and he said, all right, heads, well, don't kill each other. Could have come up the other way. Could have come up tails, and it was murder everybody. It wasn't arbitrary, okay? God did not assign moral truth arbitrarily. Neither is God at the behest of some authority higher than him. That would be logically impossible, okay? Neither of those two things is true. Rather, the good is good because God is good. Does that make sense to you? Good is good because God is good. And evil is the absence of the goodness of God. Good is good because God is good. Evil is the absence of the goodness of God. And one last thing here before we go to Q&A is people will say, well, can't atheists do good things? Yes, of course. When I was the faculty advisor of the Atheist Club, they actually had it was called Good Without God Day. And so, they had this wall, and you come up and sign your name, and say, well, look, I can help the old lady across the street carry her groceries in, and I'm an atheist. I I can clean up trash along the highway and I'm an atheist. I can stand up against animal abuse and I'm an atheist. So you're telling me that atheists can't do good things? No, that is not the argument. The argument isn't that atheists cannot do good things. They can, and they do. The argument is that there can be no real good and no real evil. In the fancy philosophical sense, it's ontology. It's about the nature of being. There can exist no true good and no true evil without an absolute standard for those things. Okay? All right, that gets us to the end of section 1.
Wow, amazing, brother.
All right, amazing.
Dude, you did that in 30 minutes. That was incredible. Give Rich a hand. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the mic around because we want to make sure it gets heard well. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring the mic.